The storm over the Atlantic had begun to ease, but the sea still heaved beneath the steel deck of the USS Langley. It was 1922, and a salty mist clung to every rail, hatch, and line aboard the strange new vessel that looked like no other warship afloat. She wasn't built to bombard coastlines or chase enemy fleets. Instead, her deck stretched long and flat, an empty stage waiting for a spectacle the world had never truly seen. Standing at the edge of that deck was Lieutenant Commander Godfrey de Courcelles Chevalier, a man equal parts nerves and resolve, preparing for the moment that could make or break the U.S. Navy's bold new experiment. They called her the Navy's first aircraft carrier, though in truth the Langley had begun life as a collier, a coal transport ship. Her conversion was born from visionary whispers within naval strategy rooms, where a few daring officers believed the future of warfare wasn't the battleship, but the airplane. To most admirals, it was nonsense. Airplanes were fragile, unstable, barely controllable machines. But men like Chevalier were determined to prove otherwise. As the Langley pitched gently beneath him, Chevalier stepped into the cockpit of his Aeromarine 39B biplane. The engine coughed and then caught with a sharp roar. There were no safety nets, no arresting wires, just him, his plane, and a stretch of wooden deck that seemed far too short. Below, sailors braced themselves. If the plane plunged into the sea, he'd be lucky to survive. But Chevalier didn't hesitate. With a shout from the deck chief, the plane lunged forward. Seconds later, it was airborne. Cheers erupted across the Langley. The experiment had worked. Chevalier had become the first to successfully land on and take off from a U.S. Navy carrier. It was a moment that would ripple through military history. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun, not with thunder or firepower, but with the quiet defiance of gravity. In the years that followed, aircraft carrier designs evolved at breakneck speed. The USS Lexington and USS Saratoga joined the fleet, massive in size and ambition. They could carry dozens of planes, refuel and rearm them mid-mission, and launch coordinated air attacks from hundreds of miles away. Still, within the Navy, many remained skeptical. Battleships had been the kings of the sea for generations. What aircraft carriers promised, mobility, flexibility, and reach, seemed too new, too uncertain. But war has a way of settling arguments. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, it was not battleships that turned the tide in the Pacific. It was carriers. The USS Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet became household names, floating fortresses that launched waves of fighters and dive bombers into combat. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, for the first time in naval history, opposing ships never saw each other. Planes fought the entire battle. At Midway, American carrier-launched aircraft crippled the Japanese fleet in a few decisive minutes, shifting the balance of power in the Pacific forever. Yet victory came at a cost. The USS Yorktown was lost at Midway, barely recovered from previous damage before being thrown back into battle. The USS Wasp and Hornet followed. Sailors and pilots lived with the knowledge that any hit to the deck or hangar could turn their ship into a flaming tomb. Landing a plane on a moving deck amid enemy fire required courage bordering on madness. But they did it, again and again. Among the rising stars of this new warfare was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Tex Landon, a carrier pilot who flew with the Enterprise during the brutal island-hopping campaigns. Landon wasn't the loudest or most decorated man on the ship, but his instincts in the cockpit saved lives more times than he could count. He had a way of flying low, hugging the waves so tightly, enemy radar often missed him entirely. His skill wasn't just in combat, he was a leader. Young pilots followed his example, and ground crews trusted him with information most officers never heard. One rainy evening in 1944, during preparations for the assault on the Philippines, Landon gathered his squadron in the mess hall. He didn't bark orders, he asked for opinions. One by one, the pilots gave their take on how the upcoming strike should unfold, what approach angles worked best, which enemy fighters posed the biggest threat, how to minimize losses. By the time they left the room, every man felt not just briefed, but trusted. That night, Landon wrote in his logbook, "We don't just fly machines. We carry the weight of 100 lives in every takeoff. And if I must fall, I'll fall forward." His squadron led the strike that sank a Japanese cruiser 2 days later. The war transformed carriers from experiments into the backbone of American naval power. Their decks launched death and relief, destruction and rescue. And when the last Japanese surrender was signed, it was aboard a battleship. But the future belonged to the flat tops. By 1945, the U.S. Navy had dozens of carriers in active service. The debate between battleship and carrier was over. In its place rose a new question. Just how far could this concept go? As the Langley sat decommissioned in a naval yard, her bones rusting under the sun, newer and bigger ships took her place. Ships with elevators, angled flight decks, radar arrays, and elevators that moved aircraft between hangars and flight lines in seconds. But every takeoff, every landing, every life saved by carrier-based air power traced back to that first flight, Chevalier on the Langley, soaring over uncertain seas. The war was over, but a new era loomed, colder, tenser, and more technologically driven than anything that came before. And at its center would remain the aircraft carrier, no longer an experiment, but a symbol of reach, resilience, and revolution. The old world of naval dominance was ending. Something far more powerful was on the horizon. The world had changed, and so had the ocean. In the years following World War II, the United States stood as a dominant naval power. But the rise of the Cold War shifted everything. No longer were aircraft carriers used solely to defeat enemy fleets. Now they had to deter an enemy that might never show its face, one armed with missiles, submarines, and nuclear warheads. It was a time of paranoia and preparation, and nowhere was that more evident than aboard the USS Forrestal, the Navy's first supercarrier. Commissioned in 1955, the Forrestal was unlike anything the seas had ever seen. She was built to handle the new jet age, stronger decks, steam-powered catapults, and larger air wings capable of delivering both conventional and nuclear payloads. Her crew exceeded 5,000, a floating city tasked with nothing less than projecting American power to every corner of the world. For those stationed aboard her, the Cold War wasn't an abstract political struggle. It was lived day by day, mission by mission. Among those serving on the Forrestal in the early 1960s was Lieutenant James Holloway, a quiet but razor-sharp aviator from South Carolina. Holloway had a reputation for precision. His landings were so smooth that flight deck crews would bet on how softly his wheels would kiss the deck. He didn't talk much, but when he did, others listened. What set him apart wasn't just his flying. It was his understanding of what the carrier had become. Holloway often said, "This ship doesn't just carry planes. It carries possibility and fear." That fear was real. The Soviet Union had developed long-range bombers, missile subs, and worst of all, their own carriers. Every mission launched from Forrestal was shadowed by the chance of escalation. In training exercises, Holloway flew simulated nuclear strike runs over the North Atlantic. Each sortie had to be perfect. A single error could turn practice into provocation. In 1962, the Forrestal was ordered into high alert during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Off the coast of Florida, she floated like a loaded gun, her squadrons fueled and ready. Holloway and his fellow pilots slept in flight gear, alert to the call that might send them screaming toward targets in Cuba, or worse, the Soviet mainland. Those 13 days felt like 13 years. The crew waited, tense and silent, under a sky they feared could turn radioactive at any moment. Fortunately, that mission never came. But the experience left a mark. Holloway later wrote that the most dangerous missions are the ones that don't happen, because they make you question who you really are when your training demands violence, but your orders demand restraint. The Forrestal returned to normal duty, but peace was always conditional. As the Cold War dragged on, the U.S. Navy continued to evolve. Newer carriers like the USS Enterprise, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, joined the fleet. With no need to refuel, she could stay at sea for months. Her reactors hummed with silent menace, a reminder that warfare was now governed by endurance, not just firepower. In 1965, as the Vietnam War escalated, Enterprise was deployed to the Gulf of Tonkin. By now, Holloway had risen in rank and transferred to the Enterprise as an operations officer. Vietnam was different. Instead of vast naval battles, the war demanded precision airstrikes against jungle targets, bridges, and hidden supply routes. Carrier-based aircraft flew hundreds of sorties per week, with pilots pushing themselves, and their machines, to the brink. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Monroe was one of those pilots, among the few women then being integrated into non-combat flight roles, but granted observation and support duties that brought her closer to combat than most. Smart, fierce, and burdened with the knowledge that her flight status was constantly questioned, Monroe absorbed everything. She studied patterns in North Vietnamese anti-aircraft fire, learned the terrain by memory, and earned quiet respect from Holloway, who saw in her the same focused drive he'd carried years earlier. One humid night, a reconnaissance pilot failed to return. The crew scrambled to locate him, suspecting he'd gone down behind enemy lines. Monroe volunteered for the search, launching in a two-seater A-6 intruder with a fellow officer. Flying low through dangerous airspace, she picked up the emergency beacon and spotted smoke near a rice paddy. They had minutes, perhaps seconds, before enemy forces reached the pilot. Monroe relayed coordinates, guided a rescue chopper in, and circled until fuel forced her home. The pilot was recovered alive. After the mission, Monroe stood on the deck beside Holloway, both watching the sunrise over the South China Sea. "You think it'll ever end?" she asked quietly. Holloway didn't answer at first. Then he said, "Wars end, but fear doesn't. That's why we stay ready." The Cold War marched on, and with it, so did the evolution of aircraft carriers. The USS Nimitz entered service in 1975, the first of a new class that would dominate the seas for the next 5 decades. She was massive, built for longevity and brutal efficiency. More than a ship, she was a message. The United States would not be outpaced, outgunned, or outmaneuvered. For Monroe and Holloway, their careers diverged. He retired, becoming an advisor on naval strategy. She stayed, rising through the ranks and becoming one of the first female officers in carrier-based operational planning. The carrier, once an experimental platform of cloth and wood planes, was now a nuclear-powered fortress carrying stealth jets, reconnaissance drones, and more firepower than entire WWII fleets. But for those who served aboard them, one truth remained constant. The ocean may be vast, but the carrier made it smaller, brought war closer, but peace as well. It remained a paradox at sea, a weapon of destruction and a symbol of presence, a threat to enemies and a lifeline to allies. And just beyond the horizon, in the wake of every mission completed and every crisis averted, the next chapter waited. The sea, after all, never truly rests. The early 21st century brought both triumph and turbulence to the decks of U.S. Navy aircraft carriers. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the geopolitical landscape had shifted, but new threats emerged like shadows cast by firelight, unpredictable, amorphous, and everywhere at once. The age of state-on-state conflict gave way to a world of asymmetrical warfare, where enemies rarely wore uniforms, and danger could emerge from a fishing boat, a desert cave, or a keyboard thousands of miles away. Through it all, the carrier endured, not as a relic, but as a shapeshifter, a machine of adaptation. The USS George H.W. Bush was the last of the Nimitz-class carriers, commissioned in 2009. At over 1,000 feet long, she towered above the sea, her deck alive with motion. Super Hornets launching with afterburners roaring, yellow-shirted deck handlers directing aircraft like orchestra conductors, and sailors working 18-hour days in the unforgiving rhythms of life at sea. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Eric Dagger Tanaka, a second-generation naval aviator, born with salt water in his blood and pressure in his veins. He had grown up hearing his father's stories from the Gulf War, of night launches, tense refuels, and quiet victories won at Mach 1. But Tanaka's war was different. By 2014, the USS Bush was stationed in the Persian Gulf, launching daily missions against ISIS targets in Iraq and Syria. The threat wasn't another navy. It wasn't radar-guided missiles or dogfights over the ocean. It was urban warfare from the sky, hitting moving convoys, fortified positions hidden in civilian zones, and doing it all with precision that didn't just demand skill, but moral clarity. Every decision had weight. Every wrong move could cost innocent lives or spark international outrage. Tanaka wrestled with this burden quietly. He carried photographs of bombed-out villages from failed strikes in Afghanistan, given to him during a NATO briefing. He studied them often, not out of guilt, but out of duty. He believed a carrier pilot should never become numb to the destruction he could unleash. When younger aviators joked about lighting up bad guys, Tanaka listened, but never laughed. He was there to execute orders, yes, but also to ask the questions others avoided. During one mission over Mosul, his wingman's targeting system failed mid-strike. The window to hit a supply cache was seconds from closing. Tanaka had a clear shot, but spotted children near the building's edge, something the drone footage hadn't shown. He called off the strike, taking heat from command for hesitating. But a week later, ground troops confirmed the building had been emptied, used as bait. Tanaka's caution had saved lives, American and Iraqi. Back on the Bush, morale ran hot and cold. Between the adrenaline of flight operations and the fatigue of deployment, tensions simmered. Still, the crew pushed forward, engineers fine. Tuning reactors, cooks serving 10,000 meals a day, pilots planning sorties through sandstorm forecasts and contested airspace. The carrier was a community sealed inside steel, powered by nuclear energy and human resilience. In 2020, a new name joined the fleet, the USS Gerald R. Ford. Sleeker, faster, and filled with bleeding-edge technology, she promised a revolution in carrier operations. Electromagnetic catapults replaced steam. Advanced arresting gear reduced wear on aircraft. Her launch cycle was faster, her radar sharper, her automation deeper. She was the future, and also a gamble. Early trials revealed flaws, faulty elevators, software bugs, missed deadlines. Critics called her a billion-dollar experiment. But for the Navy, innovation was non-negotiable. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Monroe, now a seasoned officer nearing retirement, was invited aboard the Ford as an advisor. Seeing the sleek corridors and touchscreen consoles felt surreal after decades of oil-stained bolts and manual checklists. Yet Monroe wasn't seduced by the shine. She walked the decks quietly, observing how the young crew worked, how they handled pressure, how they treated each other. She knew that no matter the technology, the soul of a carrier was its people. One evening, she met Tanaka in the hangar bay. The two shared stories over coffee beneath the belly of an F-35C. Tanaka spoke about the moral weight of modern war, Monroe about the silence that followed Vietnam. "It's not just about what we destroy," she said. "It's about what we preserve. Integrity, judgment, our ability to come home and look in the mirror." The Gerald R. Ford would go on to conduct operations in the South China Sea, the Arctic Circle, and the Mediterranean, all theaters of rising tension. As Russia pushed further into Eastern Europe and China flexed its maritime muscles, the carrier became a deterrent again, a presence, a promise, a reminder. Sailors called it heavy diplomacy. Park a supercarrier near a disputed zone, and the conversation changes. Back in the Pentagon, analysts debated the relevance of carriers in the age of hypersonic missiles and cyber warfare. Were they too big, too slow, too vulnerable? Yet every time a crisis broke, be it an earthquake, a blockade, or a rogue missile test, the same question returned. Where's the nearest carrier? In 2025, the Navy began development of the next-generation carrier concept, blending drone integration, AI-assisted flight control, and modular deck designs. They named the program Project Horizon. And while debates raged in Congress, one truth remained untouched. So long as conflict existed over the horizon, someone would have to meet it. For pilots like Tanaka and leaders like Monroe, the carrier was more than steel and turbines. It was history in motion, a floating contradiction of war and hope, destruction and discipline. Its story was not over, not by a long shot, because as long as the world remained unpredictable, the carrier would remain indispensable, not for what it destroys, but for what it dares to stand for, alone at sea, holding the line between chaos and control.